And if you know me, you know I can't stop talking about dyslexia. It's like one of my favorite topics in the world. So I'm just going to get started, jump right in, and we'll go from there. And again, thanks so much for being here. I think most of you on this call probably know me, but just in case, my name is Josh Clark. I'm the head of school here at Landmark School, and I'm so excited and look forward to getting to talk with you today about specifically about dyslexia and LBLD and what that means and what it looks like for our kids and all of those things. As we go through, I want to remind you that there is a Q&A that you are welcome to add a question to at the end. I will do my best to try to get to questions. Again, I tend to go on and on about this topic, so apologies in advance if I'm not able to get to all the questions, but I'll do my best. But again, feel free to put those in the Q&A. And we're just going to jump in and get started. All right. So, again, some of you might be more familiar with me and my story and what brings me to this space, but I always like to begin these conversations and these talks about what is dyslexia by making a personal connection because it's very personal to me. I'm dyslexic. Both of my kids are dyslexic. And so that's how I come to this space, and that's why I think I'm largely so passionate about this work. So, what I want to share with you is again a little bit of a preview or maybe a sneak peek into what it was like for me growing up as a dyslexic student. So, if again, you might have heard this story before, if you've seen this talk, but about 10 years ago or so, my mom moved. And I don't know if you've ever had this, but when a parent moves, you inherit the box you never even knew they had of all your old school paperwork and trophies and all these things. I always joke that it turns out my mom was a witch because not only did she have all of this paperwork, but she had my teeth and she had hair and all this stuff, right? From an embarrassingly older age than probably was appropriate, right? That she kept. But in this box, right, I had a third grade folder. And these are artifacts from my third grade folder that I just wanted to share with you because I think they kind of, again, give you a little of a level set, right? About what is dyslexia and how does it manifest, right? How do we think about it? So on the left-hand side, right, you'll see that's a letter I wrote in third grade. I still so clearly remember doing this. We had to write a letter to the president. And that's why it looks like that kind of silhouette of George Washington. So I'm going to read you the letter because it might be hard for you to see on your screen. But it says, Dear Bush, because I just went for it, right? No president necessary. This is the first President Bush. Dear Bush, let's talk money. If you give me $1,000, I'll give you my brother. So will you go for it? Please send money March 20th through the 25th, and you better not change your mind because the world is in danger because of my brother. So I love so much about that. To be fair, my brother and I have a great relationship to this day, right? We're really close, but clearly this was a time of difficulty for us. And clearly, spring break was coming up and I needed cash. And that's why I was trying to pawn him off March 20th to the 25th. But what you may not be able to tell through your screen is if you look really close, my teacher had to go under and decipher almost every single word because my spelling and then later on my handwriting is so compromised that you would never know what it is I was trying to communicate. And the further that letter goes, kind of the more compromised it becomes. Down there at the bottom, you see some J-A-J-U. That's me trying to spell change, right? Because I got that j, right? And I was confusing it with a J sound, right? And again, when we look at that, though, I'd like to think that it shows a little bit of creativity. It shows a little bit of, communication skills, but paired with this really, really compromised ability to spell and to kind of organize my writing legibly. In that next column, what you'll see is I grew up in Tennessee, and these are my TCAP scores from third grade. It was the first year we had state tests. I think we're all familiar with what those are and what those mean and so on and so forth. Thankfully, when I was growing up, you didn't have to pass them in order to go to the next grade, right? Otherwise, it would have been a very different trajectory for me. Because what you'll see there in that highlighted column, that's my national percentile. That's how I ranked compared to other people, right, in the same, in taking that same exact test. And what you'll see there is in my reading comprehension, I was in the 89th percentile. So when it came to my peers, when a text was read to me, I actually did better than 89% of my peers understanding what it was saying and able to answer questions. If you go down there to word analysis, though, word analysis is the ability to read a single word. I was in the 41st percentile. So I could comprehend up here, but I could read down here. And you see that kind of mismatch throughout my scores. For my language mechanics, I was in the 30th percentile. When you look at math, I was in the 20th percentile. I joke that in science and I'm spelling, I was in the 67th percentile because I cheated. Because there's no way I couldn't get in the 67th percentile today. So I don't know how that could possibly be true. Social studies, I'm in the 25th percentile, right? And again, what we're seeing is this really inconsistent application, right, of what I'm able to do. And if you just looked at me on paper, if you just looked at my scores, I look like a pretty compromised kiddo, right? I look like, gosh, great kid, super attitude, but not necessarily on the trajectory that we'd want him to be on for college and all these other things. And I so remember growing up and being told I need to take my time and work harder over and over and over again by the most well-intentioned adults in my life. If I just take my time and I work harder. And I remember thinking, I don't know how you work hard and take your time. That just made no sense to me at 9 years old. And that last column over there, this is just kind of a funny a glimpse into the early life of Josh Clark. I clearly remember third grade. We for open house, the night when your parents get to come see your classroom and you get to show them your desk and all the different ways you spend your day. For art class, I had Miss Ackerman. I'll never forget. I love Miss Ackerman, and we had to draw a self-portrait of ourselves, of what we wanted to be when we grew up. And the night of open house came, and we walk into Miss Ackerman's art classroom, and everybody's portraits are all over the room, right? Johnny's going to be a firefighter. Sally's going to be a pilot. Somebody else is going to be a doctor. Somebody else is going to be a policeman, right? All of these, wonderful ambitions just on display. And we walk in, I'll never forget, Miss Ackerman like makes eye contact with my parents and just makes a beeline to us. And in her hand is a rolled up piece of paper, and she hands it to my parents and says, I'm sorry, but I did not think it was appropriate for me to display Josh's artwork. Because what you'll see there, if you can't decipher it, that is a picture of me. That's actually me in my underwear. That kind of green bar is supposed to be cash, and those circles behind me are an audience. Because when I was in third grade, I wanted to be an exotic dancer. Because I joke, but it's true because I knew school wasn't going to work, right? I looked at those scores, I knew what was going on, and I knew I needed a hustle. Anyways, true story, right? Absolute true story that is fondly told at every family reunion throughout my life. And then I joke that, people still didn't know I was dyslexic, right? Which obviously has nothing to do with it, but it is funny about what kids will say and reveal to their teachers. But I share all that again to say that, on paper, I looked one way, right? In terms of what I was capable of, it was very different. And I'm actually quite proud of that. It's kind of hard for you to see, but behind me right now, you'll see in that frame in my office, I actually have that letter and those test scores framed, and I put it in every office I've ever had. I think just really important reminder. I go ahead and not include the self-portrait just because that tends to be a longer story that is a little bit, not always the easiest thing to tell. But so with that said, right, I also am a parent, as I said, of two dyslexic kiddos. This is an old picture. They're not nearly that adorable anymore. They're now in 7th and 10th grade, both at Landmark, both dyslexic. And I talk about them because both of them grew up in the same house, same environment, same genetics, same education, same everything, and yet their dyslexia presents itself in very different ways, right? The way that it manifests is different. My son was in close to third grade before we had him officially diagnosed, and I was doing this for a living, mind you. I was running a school in Atlanta for kids with dyslexia. And I knew in the back of my head, but I thought maybe I was pathologizing him because he was a really good reader. He comprehended, he could go through a passage, tell you exactly what it was about. But if you gave him a single word by itself, right, he had no idea what it could say if he wasn't familiar with it. His spelling, right, that's where we really saw it. His spelling was super compromised. And it was around second grade where the reels really fell off, and every night at homework was tears and all these things. And we knew we had this really smart kiddo, and yet why is all of this so hard? And then my daughter, and again, second child, luxury and to some degree, and they're like, okay, this is on our radar, let's check this out. And it was more apparent earlier in that you could just see the wheels turning in her brain when she tried to read those words, right? That k, ah, right? You could just see it, right? And again, my son, very different presentation, right? Same underlying diagnosis, same approach, right, in terms of support, but very different in their presentation, right? And I share that to say, as we go through today, and I'm talking about the dyslexic brain and the science and all these things, I just want you to remember that it's still highly individualized, right? I always say, if you've seen one dyslexic brain, you've seen one dyslexic brain, right? It's not as if there's a non-dyslexic brain and dyslexic brain, and that there's these overarching similarities based on those two categories. It's highly individualized. So, with that said, a quick story. I always like to get a little philosophical, right, as we talk about this. I had the great privilege recently of doing a little summer vacation, and we got to spend some time in Europe, right? This is actually us in Italy, and as part of that trip, we got to go to Paris. We were in Paris; it was amazing, and we went to the Louvre. And I told my kids, okay, this is a really big deal. This is high art, high culture, and we're going to see this incredibly important work of art called the Venus de Milo. Get ready, kids. And I told them, like, the Venus de Milo, it's this really famous, important painting of this lady in a clamshell, like doing a hula thing. Turns out that's actually not the Venus de Milo. That shows you how cultured I actually am. This is the Venus de Milo, right? Still super important, but not the clamshell lady. The Venus de Milo is a sculpture, right, that is often, for a variety of reasons we won't get into today, but is often kind of characterized as the epitome of Western art, the epitome of this white marble aesthetic of Greek and Roman sculpture, right, that epitomized what it means to be beautiful, to be artistic, all these things. And we're sitting there looking at this, and our tour guide pulls up his phone and he shows us this. And he shows us, on the left-hand side is how we see the Venus de Milo today. On the right, that's how we believed it would have looked during its time. And not only does it have arms, right, which makes a lot of sense, but what's fascinating to me, as you can see, is it was covered in color, right? It was actually very vibrant and colorful. And in fact, we know, and we've known for a really long time, right, which is the other crazy thing, well over 100 years, we've known that what we associate with high art as this crisp, clear, beautiful white marble that we literally build museums around and we literally put on pedestals never actually existed in real life, right? So this is another example. I think this is a frieze of some sort, maybe like something to do with Alexander the Great. I could be wrong about that. Forgive me. I'm not an art historian. But what you can see on top is it has as it exists today. And if you look, you can actually see the faded colors and hues on it. And below it is a rendition of what we think it would have looked like, right, when originally brought about, right? But what I find fascinating, right, is that we talk about white marble all the time as like the most important thing there is, right? That's what beauty is. That's what the epitome of the Western aesthetic is. And yet, it never actually existed. And we've known for a really long time. In fact, we've known for so long, but we are so invested. We are so invested in the idea of white marble being what is beauty, right? That again, we literally put it on a pedestal, that as we started to uncover these statues, we would literally start to rub the color right off of it as it was coming out of the ground because we didn't want it to contradict what we wanted to believe, right? We knew it never actually existed, but we were so invested in this misconception that we gladly, openly, knowingly just rubbed it right off. If you ever go to the Boston MFA, there's a beautiful exhibit of kind of Roman and Greek art and sculpture. And in there, there's this really cool kind of video that kind of overlays the color, right? But again, it's crazy to me. It's crazy to me. We've epitomized something. We literally worship something that doesn't actually exist. If you really want to go down a rabbit hole, there's a great New Yorker article about it. If you just Google white marble, the New Yorker, you can find there's a quote from it. The idealization of white marble is an aesthetic born of a mistake. And then we see this vase right next to it, right? That's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, of some dude literally painting a white marble statue, and yet we don't we refuse to believe it. So why do I bring this up? What's the whole point of this? What's that have to do with dyslexia? And it's this idea that in schools we perpetuate an idea of success. We perpetuate a misguided, untrue, never been real portrait of what it means to be successful. And in doing so, we often rob students of their color. In idealizing something that never actually existed and is not true, we take kids who want to learn, who are eager to read, who have all the potential and all the motivation in the world, and we just rub them raw and rub that color right off of them, right, in worship of a misguided idea of success. And that's because school is not real life. We forget that all the time. Our lives look nothing like they did when we were in school. School is a place where we're supposed to be prepared for the real world, and there's a lot of stuff we do as schools to do that. But I also think we need to recognize and acknowledge that most of us don't spend our days going from, well, we probably do cycle through a lot of meetings, but those meetings aren't dictated by different bosses who have different expectations of how we should perform, who have different measures of how they're going to determine our success. We don't then, if we are able to, then leave those meetings to spend, hours after work in order to prepare to go back into those meetings, and so on and so forth. If we have difficulties in a certain task, we may not find ourselves being attracted to that role or that kind of work. Or we also have support systems where we're able to work with other colleagues who might have an expertise that we don't. Or we have folks that help fill in the gaps for the things that we struggle with so that we can bring the best out of ourselves. But we don't do that in school, right? In school, that's cheating. In school, that's against the rules. And so I just highlight that too to remind ourselves that when we measure, going back to that idea of my own test scores, that's a measurement not of real life, but of our children on paper in a snapshot of 45 minutes or less, right? So I just think that's always an important thing to keep in mind as we talk about, right, our kids and how we're helping them navigate through school. All right. So what I want to do now is I'm going to give you a quick and dirty history of dyslexia and LBLD. And I should tell you, I meant to say this earlier, I use those terms interchangeably. Dyslexia, language-based learning differences, they're essentially the same thing, right? And I'll get more into that in a moment. But this, for me, this begins, I think, in 1857. This is a picture of Lake, I think it's Huron, I think is how you say it, in Michigan, right? So let's all pretend for a minute it's 1857. We're at Lake Huron, and we're following a little boy, 10 years old, into a one-room schoolhouse. And in my mind, it's winter because, right, it's more dramatic. It's winter. Maybe it's still dark out. This little guy gets into this one room schoolhouse. He sits at the desk he always sits at. He's getting his stuff together, prepared for his day. He's got his ink blot, right? If they still use like the ink blot and the feather, I don't know, in 1857. But he's sitting there getting ready. And his teacher comes up to him before class even begins and says, "You need to go home." And she pins a note to his jacket and says, "Take this to your mother and you need to leave." He has no idea what's going on. He has no explanation for why. In my mind, he leaves that schoolhouse. He's embarrassed. He's crying, I'd imagine, because he's afraid he's going to get in trouble. And again, it's snowing, and he's just kind of trudging through. He gets home. He walks in the door. His mother's standing there saying, "What in the world are you doing here? I just sent you off to school." She takes this note. She reads it out loud, and it says, "Dear Mrs. Edison, I am sorry, but Thomas is too stupid to learn." And that was the beginning and end of Thomas Edison's formal education, right? Thomas Edison, who went on to change our entire world in so many ways, was rejected by traditional education because he was likely dyslexic. He was likely dyslexic. And it was really, he attributes so much of his success to his mother because his mother refused to buy that narrative. His mother refused to say, "You're not capable, you're not worthy, you don't deserve an education." His mother is who helped him move forward. So now we're gonna fast forward, right? Get in our time machine. I think now we're in like 1901, 1890 something, right? So we're at the turn, approaching the 20th century. This is from a British medical journal, and it's by Dr. Hinshelwood, and it is the first medical account of what he referred to as at the time as word blindness, which we would now call dyslexia. And he was studying a family where there was a group of siblings. And within this group of siblings, they all had the same parents, had the same environment, same access to education. And there was one sibling, despite strong verbal ability, despite being able to show strong intellectual sense through conversation, seemed to be blind to words because he could not read them. Right. And again, at the time, they referred to it as word blindness. And I want to underscore that this is late 1800s, very start of the 1900s. Right. This is not 40 years ago. Right. This is well over 100 years ago. This is, I believe, 1908, sometime in the early 1900s. A different medical journal, also British, is our first account of what we would now refer to as ADHD, which, as you can see, it was referred to as some abnormal physical condition in children. And it goes on to account these kids that essentially can't seem to sit and control themselves for long periods of time, right? And again, it's the early 1900s, right? So as we talk about the prevalence of ADHD and how often we see it now, and we could have a whole nother conversation about why that may be and the underlying things, and there's lots of things to explore. I think it's also important, it's not new, right? This again, this is not a story that has come about in the last 25 years. This is a story that started over 125 years ago. Then we fast forward to the 1920s. 1920s, there's a neurologist, a medical doctor named Samuel Orton, and he is interested in patients with word blindness. He's trying to understand what is the medical and the neurological underpinnings of this thing called word blindness. Again, we would call today dyslexia. And there was a woman, Anna Gillingham, who was reading his journals and kind of his medical research on this. And she's trying to think about, how do I take this scientific, this medical lens and create a classroom application for it? And out of that came Samuel Orton, Annie Gillingham, Orton Gillingham, right? And again, this is the mid to late 1920s. If you're not familiar with Orton Gillingham, it is kind of it's now kind of a broad term that's used in a lot of different contexts. Essentially, and there is an academy of Orton Gillingham, or Orton Gillingham Academy, but it is a structured literacy approach to reading instruction. It is multisensory, it is evidence-based, it's all the things that we do at Landmark School. And again, Orton Gillingham is a term that's often used now to describe it. I think this is 1941, maybe maybe a little bit later, but 1940s. This is the cover of a Life magazine story about dyslexia. In the early 1940s, Life magazine, huge expose on dyslexia. And it's focusing on kids who are having a surprisingly difficult time learning to read, write, and spell. Obviously, just by looking at this picture, we know that at the time, right, there was this incorrect assumption that it had something to do with vision. Dyslexia has nothing to do with vision. It's not a not a visual processing difficulty at all. It's, as we'll get into, it's more phonological processing and symbol sound correlation. But in this article, it actually talks about that the vast majority of kids who don't go on to graduate high school, it's likely not because they're not intelligent enough to, but it's because they weren't able to read because they were dyslexic. Whether or not it's true, that was all speculation at the time. But again, kind of rings true. And it also speculates that that the prison system is likely filled with individuals that are dyslexic because they never learned to be able to read in school, and that led to certain consequences and limitations in their life, so on and so forth. 1940s, we could have this conversation today, right? We fast forward again, 1971, this kind of eccentric Southerner, son of a preacher who often wears the wrong shoe on each foot, confuses his left and right, finds himself at Harvard researching through the education department. How is it that I can help other kids who think like me, right, who are dyslexic? So this is obviously Dr. Charles Drake, who founded Landmark School in 1971, dyslexic himself, and really wanted to figure out, how can I apply scientific knowledge, much like Samuel Orton and Anna Gillingham, how can I apply the scientific knowledge that's coming out of research into a classroom? And the way he does it is by starting his own school. He recognizes, okay, most schools are not doing this, they're not going to do it. Their approach is not only ineffective, it's counterintuitive for our kids. So he buys an old mansion on top of a hill and starts Landmark School. Fast forwarding again, 1980s, early 1990s, there's a Harvard professor named Al Galaberta. Dr. Galaberta is interested in understanding, is there a neurobiological underpinning to dyslexia? In other words, is it a different structuring of the brain versus something that happens to the brain? Right, if you're following me here. And by looking at autopsied brains, literally by looking at brains of individuals who were believed to have dyslexia who passed away, he was able to conclude that yes, there is a neurobiological, there's a structural difference in these brains than those individuals who are not dyslexic. Interesting, when I first came to Landmark School, I was giving a similar talk to the faculty, and afterwards a faculty member came up to me and said, actually, in the during this time period, we had a former student who attended Landmark, graduated, and there was a tragic accident, and he passed away, and his parents donated his brain to this very study, right? Which is just kind of gives me chills, and all these different connections. Then we fast forward again to 2001. 2001, there's a book by Dr. Sally Shaywitz called Overcoming Dyslexia that for the longest time was kind of the Bible, the reference guide on understanding dyslexia. In fact, I always want to call it understanding dyslexia, not overcoming, because there's nothing to overcome, nor is it something that goes away. But regardless, she writes this book. She now is at Yale at the Center for Dyslexia and Creativity. And Time Magazine in 2001 does a cover story about the book and about dyslexia. And we think about the story arc of this, right? Like 1946-ish to 2001, almost the exact same story is being told, right? And here we are in almost 2026, and we could almost do the exact same thing again. Little fun fact about that Time magazine, that young man, he at the time was a student at my former school, where I was head of school in Atlanta, the Skank School. He was a student there at the time, and now his sister teaches at that school. A little fun fact. Okay, again, moving forward to the early aughts, brain imaging allows us to actually see the brain while it's reading, which we'll talk about more in a moment. But it also helps us to understand that in certain circumstances, especially when we believe through kind of a genetic predisposition, that we could actually see dyslexic brains developing different in utero, right? It does not mean that you could, diagnose dyslexia in utero. It's not that quite that level of sophistication. Just the imaging itself isn't there yet, but it definitely allows us to suggest and see that there was a different formation occurring, and then we're able to later then say, yep, the different formation also correlated with a dyslexia diagnosis, right? And so, what do we learn from all this, right? Here we are today. What do we know about dyslexia and what it all means? So, there's this great quote by Dr. Gordon Sherman, who's a former chair of the International Dyslexia Association and a Harvard neurologist. And I love this quote: "It is not a disability if you do not have what the environment does not want." Every time I read this, I feel like I have a disability because I have to read it again to understand what it says. It is not a disability if you do not have what the environment does not want. And the way I explain that is when I was in school, I was a dyslexic kid, I was never diagnosed. And despite that, I really loved learning. I hated school, loved learning. And I saw those as two different things. But in my high school at that time, right, if learning, right, were something that the environment cherished and the environment rewarded, I would have been this, right? I've been a god, right? But instead, I was in an environment that cherished this, and so I was this, right? I was a nerd, right? But I use that as an example, right? Of oftentimes it's what the environment demands of us that determines our strengths and our struggles more so than our inherent strengths and struggles. So again, to make as a further point on that, before Gutenberg in the printing press, we had no concept of dyslexia, and yet we know it existed because it's genetic, because it is of the brain, right? It's not something that came about just because we were reading. It's that it was taxed in a different way because we were asked to live in a print-saturated environment. The brain itself existed, the way it was structured, the way it was processed, all those things existed before print. The introduction of print, right, just changed the demands and therefore changed its expression. It also, I don't get into it too much, but there's a professor at Cambridge. I did this talk earlier this week and I said Oxford, and I apologize, I was wrong. It's Cambridge, Dr. Helen Taylor. I'm not sophisticated enough to fully represent her studies and her theory, but essentially she's saying, okay, if this is a thing that evolution picked, right? If it was only a disability over the hundreds of and thousands of years of human existence, it probably would have been canceled out. So, but it wasn't, right? And so she looks at that individuals with dyslexia have some kind of neurological tendency for exploration. And she uses this analogy of bees. And apparently in beehives, there are certain bees that are the explorer bees. They actually go out farther than the other bees to find like kind of the next nectar or whatever it is, and then come back. And she suggests that dyslexia and other areas of neurodiversity, there's aspects of it that are likely associated with that kind of evolutionary advantage of seeing and understanding and doing things differently because we have to adapt. If we only ever lived the way we always lived, right, we wouldn't exist because as we all know, right, life is an adaptation both in the short term and in kind of this meta sense of it all. So um, I say all that to say I always like to think about or help us think about that dyslexia is a learning difference. It's not an inability to learn, right? It is a different way of learning and put in an environment where you're not understood, where you're not supported, where you don't have the tools and the support that you need, it quickly becomes an environmental disability. But that doesn't, it's not a universal disability. I always give the example, for a lot of our kiddos, they don't feel dyslexic on the soccer field, they don't feel dyslexic on the stage, they don't feel dyslexic in these places where they have confidence and they shine and and then building their Legos and all these other things, right? It's the environment itself that brings that puts a pressure on this. It can also be a school-based disability, right? I'd like to think when students get to Landmark and they're with us, we remove that disability that they were first experienced because we understand them, we're giving them the tools, we're helping them progress, as opposed to being in a place that we all did with the best of intentions. We put them there, people didn't understand them, it wasn't built for them, and it exasperated their struggles. And I also want us to have room for the idea that it can also be a valued difference. And that's what I'm going to get to in a moment. Again, going back to that idea, that kind of evolutionary, why was, if over time God and evolution selected it for whatever reason, right? Why might that be? And I want to kind of talk a little bit about that as we go through. So this is a great quote from a book called The Dyslexic Advantage. Another book, if it's not on your radar, I highly recommend reading it. It's a really accessible kind of breakdown of the science of dyslexia, and then it profiles, to be fair, some dyslexic superstars, right? I don't want you to ever like think that if your kid's not Steve Jobs, you're not good at being dyslexic. But it does characterize some individuals who are very dyslexic and incredibly successful, and kind of creates these threads, these trends, these overlaps in abilities and competencies that are often associated to varying degrees with folks with dyslexia. So this great quote says, when it comes to learning, there's no good or bad, right or wrong, only a difference in style, which should be fostered rather than corrected, which again, this thing's super important as we think about our kids' brains, which we're going to dive into in a moment. It's not about fixing something, it's about understanding something. There's a big difference there, right? Once I understand how your brain works, I can give you the support that you need to maximize it. I'm not here to fix it because fixing implies that something's broken. So I'm just going to torture you through a couple slides in silence. All right. So hopefully, as you went through that, right, you couldn't help but read it. I asked politely for you not to, but you could not help it, right? Reading has become this innate automatic process for you, right? And yet, chances are, unless you speak Arabic, you came across this and had nothing, right? Whereas somebody else, right, would have the potentially have the opposite experience, or if they're bilingual, they might have been able to read both. And I highlight that because we often think of reading as this natural process, this kind of God-given ability that we were put on this earth to do, but that's actually not true. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And it's highlighted here, right? If this was a natural act that we were all inherently born to do, then we wouldn't come to this and not know what to do with it, right? Reading's cultural, reading's environmental, reading is an invention, right? It is a technology just like our iPhone, as hard to believe as that may be. So now I'm going to show you a quick video. This is actually an animation that I helped put together at my first school for kids with dyslexia which is in Memphis, Tennessee, called the Bodine School, about 10 years ago. Turn up your volume. You should be able to hear it, but feel free to turn up your volume so that you can listen to it. And it's going to explain to you what is reading. That's what it's going to explain to you. So let me get it queued up.
Talk about reading. I think many people don't have an appreciation for how complex this really is. Many of us don't understand that while we were put on this earth to see and to talk and to hear, we weren't put here to read. Reading is not a natural act. There's not one part of our brain that controls it. It's actually many different things coming together at once to create a reader. And when you look back to the creation of reading 2,000 years ago, it was actually a new technology, just like anything else. In fact, like many new technologies, reading was actually quite controversial. Socrates himself believed that reading was going to be the end of modern civilization. You see, you have to understand that during Socrates' time, a person's intellect was judged by their ability to memorize long passages and then recite them from memory. So the concept of reading was an affront to their system for understanding who was smart and who was dumb. Now, fast forward 2,000 years later to the present time, and we now use a system of intelligence where we ask people to take 26 symbols, translate them into 40 speech sounds that have over 250 representations, and we use that process to decide who's smart and who's dumb. But not only that, we ask folks to do it instantaneously. And despite the fact that it took us 2,000 years to develop it, we ask our students to master it in less than 2,000 days. And if they don't, we blame the child and not the system. And because it's so complex and it's so high stakes that students are able to do this, I think it's really important that we take a step back and look at our brain on reading. So let's take the word cat. When I come across the word cat, lots of things come together at once in order for me to be able to read it or decode it. The first thing I do is take that symbol C. That C goes into my brain and I try to find a mental image you can match it with. Once I do that, I then take that symbol and I try to figure out where it is in the word and the symbols around it to help create a sound association. Once I have that sound association, I then look at the next symbol and again bring it into my brain, try to map it to a mental image that already exists, assign it a sound based on the sound that came before it, and so on and so forth until I get to CAT as cat. Now that I've decoded the word, I have to instantaneously go through a series of tasks associated with language processing. I have to take that word cat, assign it a definition. What does the word cat mean? That definition is also informed by my own background knowledge. What are my experiences with cat, and how does that inform my understanding of this word? At the same time, I have to figure out the syntax. Is the cat performing the action, or is the action being performed upon the cat? And even still, I have to stop and think, is the cat part of a larger thought? Is it an inference or a metaphor? All of these things, along with my decoding tasks, come to form comprehension. And it doesn't matter if I've been reading for 10 days or 10 years, my brain always has to work through the same tasks. So the next time you pick up a book and you see that word cat, take a moment to appreciate the miracle that is reading.
All right. Hopefully that was informative, right? And if you take nothing else away from this, our time together, take this. Reading is complex. It's not one thing, it's a whole lot of things. It's not one part of our brain, it's a lot of part of our brains. And our brains were never designed to do it in the first place. So what you see here is one of my favorite things in the world. I'm such a nerd. This is Scarborough's reading rope. I would frame it and have it over my mantle at my house if my wife would let me. And this is just, I think, this beautiful explanation for the complexity and all the tasks that are associated with reading. So if you see on the far right hand side, it says skilled reading. And if we move, and that's when we comprehend, we're reading at an appropriate rate, right? So it's not taking us, 10 times longer than our peers, all those things. We are a skilled reader. And if we move backwards from there, what we could see is these two ropes that have to come together. But even more so, we keep going back. Each rope is made of individual strands, which are individual cognitive tasks that our brain has to process through every single time we read. And what you can see there is that over time, we become increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic, which is why for many of us as adults, we don't realize that we're reading anymore, right? It's not something that we as laborious as it once was because it's become more automatic, and we're also on a kind of a subconscious level much more strategic about the effort that we're putting forward, based on what we're trying to accomplish in that particular scenario. But what I want you to see here is that up top is language comprehension. So those are language tasks. That's our ability to understand the background knowledge, right? Which we'll talk more about in a minute. That's super important. Our vocabulary knowledge, language structure, right? Is the road is run down by the cat. The cat ran down the road, right? Understanding that means the same thing. Verbal reasoning, right? Our ability to make inference, to understand metaphor. She is as beautiful as, but that's some simile. Go for it. Simile. She's as beautiful as a rose, right? Knowing in our brains what that means. And then also literacy knowledge itself. For a lot of kids, we have to be very explicit and help them understand that a bolded word in a textbook means something, right? That could be important. Or when you're reading your social studies textbook and there's at the top it says the title of the particular passage, that's meaningful. That's giving you a clue into what you're about to read, right? That's language. And then at the bottom is word recognition. That's the ability to decode words and recognize sight words. So that's that it's also that knowing that the is the every single time you see it. And for those of us that are parents of kids with dyslexia, or if you remember your own experiences, we know it was the on Wednesday, and on Thursday it was like, now what is this? So that's what that looks like. For a long time, we used to talk about dyslexia only on the bottom, right? We really talked about dyslexia as a difficulty sounding out words, manipulating sounds in words, and sight word recognition. But what we know to be true today is that it's it's very rare to find an individual who is their sole difficulty, right, is in that. Instead, for most individuals with dyslexia, they have a spectrum of strengths and struggles throughout the rope, right? Some of our kids have really high verbal reasoning, really great vocabulary. Uh, but they might struggle with language structure, right? And with decoding, right? So again, we're going to come back to this in a moment, but just the complexity of reading is what I want you to take away from this. Quick, and just to further, double click on that complexity, right? This is a study that called the baseball study, super famous study. And what they did was they took a group of kids, that they had assessed and found to be strong, skilled readers, and then took a group of kids that they had assessed and were known to be poor readers, right? So they took this group of kids and they gave them a test, they gave them a passage and asked them to read this passage about baseball. And what they also did was they divided the kids between kids that were strong readers and knew a lot about baseball, strong readers knew nothing about baseball, poor readers knew a lot about baseball, poor readers knew nothing about baseball. And what you can see here just from the graph, not surprisingly, the kids that performed the best were strong readers who had a strong background knowledge around baseball, but just barely, not far behind them at all. I think very surprisingly are the poor readers who knew a lot about baseball, right? They actually did better by a significant margin than the kids that were good readers and who knew very little about baseball, right? And it just shows you that when we pull different threads on that rope, can make a really big difference. And it also underscores why every single piece of the rope is so important, not just one, right? We often talk about reading only about decoding. Decoding is one incredibly important part of a lot of important parts, right? And again, I just find this fascinating. And again, it just that idea of the representation of dyslexia across the spectrum, the number one indicator of whether or not a kid's going to comprehend something is whether or not they have background knowledge in it. Number one, right? The more you know about something, the more you're going to be able to read it, and the more engaged you're going to be, most likely, in the process itself. I always say if you give me a PhD level dissertation on dyslexia, I could probably figure it out for the most part. If you gave me an eighth grade physics book, I'd be lost, right? And it's not because of necessarily my decoding skills. It's a lot of my background knowledge. All right, so now that we know what reading is, what's dyslexia, right? This is actually a really interesting time to have this conversation, and I'm going to do this relatively quickly because I want to make sure I don't take up too much of your lunch break. But this is, I think, I say 2002. I actually think it's a 2001 is when this was officially adopted. A definition of dyslexia by the International Dyslexia Association. This is the most cited and used definition, period, in scientific research, in legislation, and policy. This is the most cited piece of research. I have the unique privilege of being the chair of the International Dyslexia Association. And so I talk about this definition a lot. And I used to talk a whole lot about that big, bolded, underlined word, unexpected, right? Because what it did for me is it was a great way to describe a landmark kiddo in that we have a kid that we're surprised is having a difficult time learning to read, write, and spell. We're surprised that based on their overall cognitive profile and what we know about them, that they're having this difficulty, right? Well, as with all things, or as all things should be, science is not about knowing, science is about wondering, questioning, answering. And since 2001, the science has evolved a great deal. So we are actually in the process right now of, this is a quote by Carl Sagan, science is a way of thinking much more than it's a body of knowledge. So we are currently at the end of over a year long process where we are introducing a revised definition of dyslexia, right? So we're taking we revisited the IDA definition, which is the most cited and referenced. We went through an over a year-long process of revisiting and revision. And at the end of this month, at the International Dyslexia Association conference in Atlanta, we're going to be officially publishing the revised definition. What's really cool about this, I had the unique, and I still don't understand why, privilege of being on the executive committee of the dyslexia definition group. And so what you'll see here, this is the entire steering committee. We had a 2-day retreat in Houston in April of last year. And the folks, this is like the Jedi Council of Dyslexia in this picture, which is, again, I have no idea why I was invited, but these are folks from literally all over the world, Japan, Mexico, Russia, who look and study dyslexia. What's really interesting is the gentleman on the bottom, kind of in the center, in the blazer and with glasses and checkered shirt. That's Dr. Charlie Haynes. Dr. Charlie Haynes, along with next to him is Dr. Malt Yoshi, and then next to him is Dr. Hugh Katz, and then my idiotic self. But those three were the co-chairs of the process, and Dr. Haynes actually started his career as a teacher at Landmark School. In the early 80s, he worked at Landmark. He actually started our expressive language program, went on to MGH, and recently retired as one of the most revered and accomplished researchers in the field, and again, started at Landmark. But I think this is really cool, right? So it's actually an interesting time to talk about dyslexia because it just shows that science evolves, right? It changes. And so I'm not allowed to actually show you the actual definition yet. It's under embargo, though we did do public comment where we had over 4,000 people comment on a draft of it. So it's not necessarily that big of a secret, but so I don't get myself in trouble, I'm not going to reveal the definition, but I do want to talk about some things that motivated kind of this revisit and this revision. And one's this idea of an international perspective, right? Dyslexia is not unique to English. It is, again, because it is of the brain. It shows itself across all cultures, all socioeconomic, all languages, so on and so forth. But the way it presents itself can be impacted by the language itself. Interestingly, one of the things that I learned as part of this process in working with some of our international colleagues and researchers, that the idea of spelling is not a universal concept. There are a lot of languages where spelling is not a thing, right? And it's because those languages are so transparent. The idea of having to kind of like encode a sound and depending on its use case, right? Like think about A and then think about AI and how those make very different sounds. Um, that's not necessarily a universal concept in many languages. So a lot of languages don't even have the word spelling, which I thought was fascinating, right? So talking about dyslexia specifically or only as a spelling difficulty is just a misnomer. And then also this idea of looking at it is neurobiological, but it's also genetic. There are also environmental factors. And what I don't mean by environmental factors is that none of us read to our kids enough. But what I do mean is that there are, as we know more about genetics, genes can kind of be turned on and off in a very complex way that we don't fully understand but that experiences alone can impact, right, how somebody how their dyslexia is expressed, right? For some kiddos, they walk into first grade, kindergarten, and their dyslexia maybe is not that challenging, right, in terms of their innate abilities, but the anxiety of it, right? Being in this class, go, 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 why can't you do this, right? That alone interacts, and there's this interplay, right? And that can change your trajectory. Individuals that maybe have a low kind of genetic profile and tendency for dyslexia, but are in a really language poor environment when no one talks to them, they don't have exposure to words or sounds, right? That can change things. So super interesting. What I want to highlight here, though, too, is as I mentioned, I was a super fan of unexpected because to me it made so much sense. But we've also come to understand that word has been kind of weaponized against kids. And what happened in many cases is that folks would say, "Well, you know what? That kid's poor, and so it's not unexpected that they have a difficult time learning to read, so they don't get to be dyslexic, literally, right? Or that kid speaks in a dialect, or that kid comes from a home where English isn't the primary language, so there's nothing unexpected there, right? They're supposed to be a bad reader. What? That's disgusting. But that has happened a lot, right? So that is something that was certainly explored during part of these conversations. And so anyway, I share all this, and there's also now a lot of research that we all know as individuals, but a lot of research that dyslexia also can have a social emotional impact, potentially from an actual kind of genetic or neurobiological predisposition for larger degrees of empathy, which I won't go into right now, but there's a lot of studies that suggest kids with dyslexia are more empathetic than their peers. And that empathy can also lead to anxiety. It can also lead to depression. It can also lead to other things, especially when unrecognized and not supported. That can further. So interesting, interesting time to talk about dyslexia. And again, I think a really interesting way of thinking about that. Science, science changes, and we have to respond to it. All right, so why do all these things happen? So this is Stanislavski, I believe I'm saying his name right. Really, I believe French. Really significant dyslexia and reading researcher. This is his image. I apologize if it's so kind of blurry, but the idea is if you see those colored circles, think of those as like train stations, right? Or even power grids, right? Or power hubs, right? Then the arrows are the tracks or the power lines connecting them all. And what I really want you to take away from this is see how complex the reading circuit is. It's not one part of your brain, it's many parts of your brain, none of which we were born to use in the way reading requires us to use them. We are repurposing parts of our brain in order to become readers, right? Again, it's an invention, it's a technology. That red circle there, that's our sometimes called the letter box or the visual word form area. That's where we first take that symbol and try to make reasoning of it. It's actually designed, by evolution and by God to help us recognize faces, which will be important in a moment, right? But it's not there to recognize letters. It's there to recognize faces because we are predispositioned as babies to know a face. That's when a baby is born, it looks at a face, right? So again, think about a circuit and think about the complexity of that circuit and think about you're trying to, like, first time I ever drove into Boston when I moved here and I ended up in a tunnel and then my GPS didn't work and I was absolutely lost and somehow what should have taken 15 minutes was 45 minutes, right? That's kind of similar to how reading goes, right? Especially for our dyslexic kiddos, right? It's super easy to get in the tunnel. So this is kind of a representation of our brains on reading. And the top is a dyslexic brain. I'm sorry, the top is a non-dyslexic brain. On the bottom is a dyslexic brain. And what you'll see there on the top is that those colors represent kind of common areas of activity during reading as we see through brain imaging, through functional brain imaging. What you'll see is that for most non-dyslexic individuals, most of that reading circuit happens on the left side of the brain, right? And again, it somewhat is and correlates with what we just saw earlier. Then you look at that dyslexic brain, right? And you can see that it looks very different. The parts of the brain that light up are very different than the non-dyslexic brain. And it's actually a bit of a misleading representation because it's not as if that's what all this all dyslexic brains do. It's actually more like most non-dyslexic brains do this. Dyslexic brains just like do this, right? It's kind of like choose your own adventure, right? It's not a different set path. It is a multitude of different paths. It is literally that brain trying to muscle its way through to figure out how to make this thing happen. And what we also know that through after the kind of remediation that students receive at Landmark, we will actually see a change in the circuitry. We'll actually see that they become more efficient readers by making it look a little bit more like what we see up top. All right, I know I'm getting close on time, so I'm gonna do this quickly. All right, so we all see a face. Look at that face. Actually, that's the face, right? You don't realize it. You see that, and your brain makes it a face because your brain has an evolutionary biological predisposition to see faces. But in actuality, that's what it looks like, right? We see these faces. We see these faces, and we have no response, most likely, right? Chances are they're just faces to us. We see both of these faces, regardless of our opinion on either of them, we most likely have some kind of response. Immediately, automatically, our brain brings meaning to it. And I say that because remember, the part of our brain that we use to identify a symbol is the same thing, right? We have that's why we're able to naturally attract to it. And then the same way we might have a response to these two faces is the same reason, kind of in the broad scheme of things, why we have a response to a symbol being associated with the sound. And again, we do it instantly, right? Making it happen almost subconsciously. But then think about this, right? When we think about why kids reverse letters, it's not because they see them differently. It's not because, they intellectually don't understand what makes what sound. It's because we are biologically, again, our brains are built to see a face, whether it looks up or down. Same, like think about like a chair. When a child sees a chair, very quickly they come to understand that's a chair, whether or not it's on its side, whether it's upside down, whether it's leaning back. A chair is a chair is a chair, but a letter is not a letter is not a letter, right? So again, the same part of our brain, right, that we're using for this is predispositioned against us in this sense. And that's why it's not, again, it's not uncommon. That's why we see letter reversals and things like that. Not because of vision, not because of intellect, but kind of a hard wiring, right? We're actually doing what we're supposed to do, and we kind of have to get our brains to learn how to cheat a little bit more. So I always talk about this as this concept of a different way of thinking, right? And I don't want to minimize it. There are definitely being in a print saturated environment where your brain is not designed to efficiently process through it can have true disabilities. It can be a true detriment, right? That's why at Landmark we're trying to help. We're trying to kind of help build up and shore up those skills. At the same time, there is also something to processing and seeing an incredibly complex and incredibly unpredictable world differently, right? I use the example of when we were all in middle school and we went through the Age of Explorers and we talked about how, there were these Western explorers that wanted to find a shortcut to the Asian spice trade, right? Everyone else was going down around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa and really dangerous and long trip. And these folks went out west and they thought there was going to be a Northwest Passage. They thought they could find a way through the continent of North America. Didn't exist, right? It ended up actually being super inefficient, not the right way to accomplish that particular goal. And at the same time, at least from a Western perspective, they discovered mountains and rivers and lakes and valleys and things that, again, from a Western perspective, we never even knew existed. So there is something to turning left when everybody else turns right, even when it can create difficulties. So if we know so much, why do we still have these problems? The example I like to give, I imagine this is still true for the city of Boston. I haven't looked at the most recent results, but I think at least in 2023, and I'm confident today, and in most metropolitan cities in the US, you would have a better statistical probability of surviving the Titanic than you would be a competent reader by the end of third grade. Right? So I'm going to say it again. You have better survival rate of the Titanic than third grade reading scores, right? In most metropolitan areas across the US. So if we know so much, why is this? Complicated answer. Part of it's the reading wars and this idea for a very long time. We used an approach to reading that was more about guessing, that was more about context, and it wasn't about skill development, right? Look at that first letter. Is that a B? What other words start with B? Is there a picture you can look at? Oh, that picture's a bear. That probably means that word's bear, right? That's a terrible way to learn to read. But that's for a lot of kids how they continue to be taught to read, despite science telling us otherwise. So what we want is a code-based, a structured literacy-based approach to reading, where we start with specific skills, and that's what we do at Landmark all day, every day, in every single class. we are reinforcing and introducing those skills. And it's not one or the other, right? I also want to point out that it's not just skills, it's taking those skills and then making sure we're connecting them to comprehension and big ideas and content and application, right? It's we've got to make sure that that connection is there. So again, I know I'm getting overtime. Feel free. I won't even know if you dropped, so I can't see you. So if you have to drop, don't worry, we'll get your recording. But I wrap up in the next 4 minutes or so. This is a great illustration that just it's called the reading ladder, and it just shows you how kids learn to read. And what I want you to take away from that is about 5%, somewhere between 5 and 10% of kids are going to learn to read by osmosis. They don't need anything. Their brains are predispositioned. They're going to become readers. Maybe 40% overall of kids are going to learn to read just by pure exposure, right? Approximately 40% of kids, their brain are predisposition. You read to them, give them an idea of how it works, they're going to become readers. Roughly 60% though, it's not going to work. Roughly 60% of kids need explicit, direct instruction like we do at Landmark every day. So as miraculous and as wonderful as it is that we're able to kind of build and design for each kid at Landmark, it's exactly what they need and it would actually benefit everybody, right? So it's not like there's a dyslexic way of learning to read and a non-dyslexic way. It's actually the way that we do it at Landmark, that structured literacy approach, that Landmark learning model actually would benefit all kids. The difference is in volume, right? Our kids need more of it, right? That's why in our elementary programs, kids spend 50% of their day immersed in elementary and middle school program, immersed in explicit structured reading instruction. And even our high school, depending on what a kid is at, they might also experience that if that's where they're at and that's what they need. So this is structured literacy from the International Dyslexia Association. This is kind of just like what kids need. I'm gonna go through it rather quickly. Here's that reading rope again, and what I want to show you is how it overlays. So this is at our we call it our literacy ecosystem. This is specific to elementary, middle school. Again, it also exists in the high school. It's just a little bit more variable, right? Because the kids' different skill levels, right, of where they are and what they need. But it's fairly prescriptive in that, right? We are taking certain sections of our day and making them explicitly about parts of that reading rope, right? It's multifaceted, it's complex, right? So all of our kids in our elementary, middle school program, over the course of 2 days, have 4 literacy intensive classes that get at every aspect of that rope. And in any given day, they're spending 50% of the time in explicit literacy. But keep in mind too, high school and at EMS, content classes are also reading classes, right? You don't stop having, so everyone's trained in the same methodology. Everybody has the same knowledge set. And so when I'm decoding a word in social studies class, I'm using the same kind of techniques. I'm getting the same kind of support I would in my tutorial class, right? It's that interconnectedness and that cycle. And again, it's also so important to remember that content plays such a significant role in this, because you can't make a better science reader by not teaching a kid science. All right, so I'm going to come to an end. I'm going to skip this video. What I really want you to know, and I hate I don't have enough time for this one, but again, what we also know that there are certain competencies that are often associated with individuals with dyslexia. Different ways that individuals with dyslexia see themselves as having strengths. And I could spend all day on that. If you're interested, definitely check out madebydyslexia.org. It's a group I'm super involved with that talks a lot about that. But what the connection I want to make right very quickly is that as we think about the future, as we think about this crazy world that we live in and AI and how jobs are going to change, and the CEO of Walmart a couple weeks ago said, if you're not, every single job in the world is going to change. If you're not thinking about it, you're missing the boat. When we look at what we predict to be the most in-demand skills of the future, they are literally the very things that are often the strengths associated with individuals with dyslexia. So it's our job to shore up the skills that they struggle with, to shore up those skills while also equally investing in what they're good at, because it's that match, that powerhouse that's not only going to make our kids successful. There's an argument can be made that they're actually the best built for the world they're going to inherit if we can get them the support they need, if we can give them that direct instruction. All right, I am gonna end. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Again, no problem for me to drop. I know there's one question in there that I'm happy to answer, and that's about, I get it. It's not good or bad. I love my kid, right? But I still worry about how are they gonna, in a text-induced world, and in a world where they have to read, how do I make sure that they can do that, right? Other than, believing you, Josh, What are some strategies for us parents to support our kiddos best? Great question. So I think there's a multitude of things, right? First of all, we need to build self-awareness and self-confidence, right? I always say I can teach a kid to read. It's a heck of a lot harder to build back their confidence, right? So what are they good at? Let's make sure that at no point in time are we saying, well, we're not going to do baseball because you're going to go and read more, because that's taking away from them, right? How they see their abilities and what they can contribute, right? So let's give them opportunities to find their success. Let's be very open and talk about what are your strengths and weaknesses. Turns out everybody has strengths and weaknesses, not just dyslexic kids. It just means that school happens to really kind of bring yours out, and good or bad, we got a whole bunch of testing on it, right? But everybody has strengths and weaknesses. Let's talk about what those are. And when we think about our struggles, what are the things that are in our control? What are the choices that we can make? That's a lot about what our advisory program is about, that executive function stuff. What is it that we need to do in order to be successful, and what is within our control? Goal setting, as silly as it can be, is a great example of that. Often I hear from kids, my goal is to get all A's. That's not a goal because that's not in your control. What's in your control is the steps and the choices you make towards that effort, right? So in our high school program, I'm going to go and make sure that I go to office hours for math class because that's an area I have a really difficult time on. I'm going to make a commitment to go every Tuesday. In elementary, middle school, right? I'm gonna read on my own a book that I can access for 10 minutes every single day. Those kinds of things, right? Being very clear with kiddos. What are your skills? What can we do? Reading to your kids is great, depending on their age, right? Actually, I'd say read to your kids at any age, but reading to your kids is super important. Immersing your kids in grade level text and grade level content is super important. Again, if they struggle to read the word and they know nothing about space, they're going to have a harder time learning to read about space, right? So, as silly, as cliche as it is, but it's true, going to museums, right? My son is obsessed with YouTube, and as often as I'm disturbed by that, I often find too that he's watching history, videos, and he knows all this stuff about the Prussian War and da da da. All that's building reading. All that's making him a better reader, right? So all these things are what we can do, and also, have taken full advantage of having conversations with the child's teacher, their advisor. Let's look at the data, right? Where are we seeing progress? Where are we not? And it's always going to be this, right? It's not no, it's not never this, right? It's a little bit of this, right? And that's just how life works in general, right? But let's look at that. Let's talk about that. Let's reassess where we're getting an impact, and are there things that we need to see? Because what I also want to say is, like, I want it to get harder. I don't want it to get easy. I want it to remain harder because we're pushing text in front of you that you can now do, right? I I always have, I don't want to say I don't want reading to be easy for our kids, because I want it to be easy, but I always want it to be challenging. Because if it's not challenging, I'm not giving you the right level of text. So those are the kinds of things that I think we as parents can engage in. Partner with the school, partner with our kids, self-awareness, self-advocacy. Metacognition, knowing how you learn and what your learning looks like and what you need to be a good learner and a good thinker is so important. All right, thank you all. Thank you for sticking out to 109. I apologize. I hope nobody gets in trouble. But thank you so much. You can always reach out to me directly or anybody else on Landmarks campus. I hope this was informative. I hope it was helpful. And thanks so much. And have a great day and have a great long weekend. For those of you that are going to get the long weekend, I hope it's a great one. Thanks.